Alright guys, welcome to F1 News. It's all going on ahead of the Chinese Grand Prix with questions over freight delays raising thoughts as to whether we'd even get a Grand Prix weekend. That situation now seems to be resolved, but not the situation with the engine drama that is about to unfold over the next few years. We know that next year in 2026, the engine formula changes dramatically, and very controversially so according to many fans, manufacturers, and even the governing body themselves. Over the last couple of weeks, there have been further rumours about a potential return to V10 or potentially V8 engines. There's lots of talk about that today, and reports from very credible sources suggesting the plan in the near future may change dramatically with a return to naturally aspirated V10 engines as soon as 2028. This is something that many Formula 1 fans would celebrate, and it seemed like a pipe dream not that long ago, but now there is serious credibility behind this, but isn't actually just a massive power struggle between the FIA and the teams, because there's plenty of other drama about that on the day as well. Very much enjoy your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I greatly appreciate it. Loads of new subs as well yesterday, massively appreciate that. Let's begin here. So Kim Ullman did a video and also a comment on this today on his Instagram suggesting that there have been technical issues coming out of Australia from like an aircraft perspective to get the freight into Shanghai. It's a massive challenge to deassemble the car, put it all into the boxes, get it flowed out to, especially a country like China where, you know, getting things into the country isn't always the easiest thing to do anyway, and additional delays has meant that the freight from many teams, especially Williams, but also Red Bull, McLaren, Mercedes, three of the absolute front runners and the teams that actually did finish in the top positions back in Australia have all been affected by this. Even, I mean, if you look at the top five, right, from the Australian Grand Prix all the way down to Lance Stroll in P6, all of those were from these teams. McLaren won the race, Red Bull was second, Mercedes were third and fourth, and Williams were fifth. So not an ideal scenario at all. This unfortunately does happen from time to time, and reportedly this was affecting Pirelli as well. So the tyres actually getting to where they needed to be was also a problem for this weekend, because as I record this video, it is, you know, evening time in China, which is not, and on the Wednesday, right, which is not ideal when obviously Thursday is, let's just say, setup day, but you want to have everything ready easily by that point. The drivers are going to be spending their time with the press conferences, so there's not all the time in the world to get everything sorted, and then they've got to be on track for the Friday. Does seem like, though, just in time, this has been somewhat resolved. I think the positive thing that some teams would say is like, oh, well, you know, maybe Fred Vasseur pulled the plug or something and made it so the freight couldn't arrive, because it seemed like Ferrari were there and they were okay, because this was earlier this afternoon with the Ferrari front wing and all the other stuff that they've put together for the Grand Prix. So, you know, you can see the side pods, the engine covers, that type of stuff. So it seemed like it was all okay for Ferrari, and as of just a couple of hours ago, we got this image and some other images going around as well of some of the freight arriving for the Red Bull team and presumably every other team as well. So definitely later than planned. Typically, the teams would be able to start setting all the things up they need to set up on early Tuesday. It's going to be near enough 36 hours delayed, which is a problem. It happens. The engineers will just have to work overnight, like the mechanics, right? We'll just have to put on an absolute shift, but it does not look likely to affect the actual running on track, I would say, this weekend. This, though, may affect the season, not in Australia, but I'm almost certain that if nothing changes, this will be a relevant factor this year. So you guys may remember a couple of weeks ago we talked about Adrien Fourmeau, who was fined 10,000 euros for saying a word in an interview in Sweden in the World Rally Championship, and they've decided that they're going to protest this. And this is a pretty big step. I think it's frankly a rather inevitable step, but it is nonetheless a really big deal that WRC drivers have refused to comment or only spoke in their native language rather than in English as they're meant to explain why they're not commenting during the post-stage interviews at the shakedown for the Safari Rally over there in Kenya. This is actually the statement that was put out today by the World Rally Drivers Alliance, which again, it's a very big deal. And whether the Grand Prix Drivers Association follow up with something similar in due course, I think it was really that particular fine that, I mean, it's rubbed everyone up the wrong way. Nobody is happy with this, really. Like, no one likes this. Not the teams, not the drivers, not the fans. The FIA and Ben Sulayem, of course, is on his crusade to shut down the swearing, and it's probably going to backfire, let's be real. And I do think this is relevant to what we're going to discuss with the V10s, because there is definitely some political posturing and scheming here going on with the discussions around the V10, as there always is in Formula 1. We all agree to keep rudeness at the microphone to a minimum. At the same time, it is necessary to maintain a certain freedom of expression and to keep emotions alive. While drivers don't need to be afraid of getting punished in any way, we have asked the president of the FIA for some positive changes in the rules to help us achieve this goal. For the reasons explained in our statement, it is impossible for us to guarantee that we, drivers and co-drivers, will be able to follow these rules perfectly and systematically. We know that now there are fines in place. You get fined 10,000, 40,000, 120,000 euros. You get docked championship points potentially if you do it multiple times. You get banned from races potentially if you do it multiple times. It's an absolute joke, as we all know. That's why we, members, are now taking the responsible decision to remain silent at the end of the interviews or to answer in our mother tongue. In the only interest of our sport, such an action is unfortunately needed, and we apologise to all the rally fans, even though we know they support us in this, which is quite the statement to close out with and say, look, obviously it's unfortunate for the fans and the journalists and everything involved, but it is a pretty effective, I would say, approach to just be silent, because then everyone gets annoyed who's trying to make things work, which is the way to put pressure on. The journalists, the media that are trying to get some comment, right, they won't be able to do so, certainly not as easily as they might be able to traditionally. It's kind of the Max Verstappen approach at the end of last year, where he would just say nothing in the press conferences, and that seems to be a strategy that can be employed, especially if it's employed by everyone. Like, could you imagine you go to the driver press conferences on the Thursday, as in tomorrow, none of the F1 drivers say anything, they simply nod their head and smile, and they say, tyres are good, car is good, engine is good, or like the opposite, whatever. That's all they say. The journalists, the media aren't happy about it. The fans, I mean, are not necessarily happy about it because they don't get to hear what their drivers actually have to say, but also the fans would support them in the same because everyone is not happy with the direction of the FIA is taking. So, that's a big development today. And again, it's more political drama. The funny thing is that just as soon as this happened, like an hour later, we then got the V10 story, which has really been doing the rounds today. And I wouldn't say has been taking some of the heat away from the FIA, but I do think that is part of the reason why the FIA are pushing this, is to gain some goodwill somewhere, depending on your perspective. Bit of drama as well between Red Bull and McLaren, who's shocked. Horner and Zach Brown are at it again. And, so Zach Brown was asked the question, like, is your beef with Horner real? Like, is it just for the cameras and whatever? And Zach Brown says this, it is genuine. I don't like how he rolls, and no doubt he feels the same about me, but it's good for the sport. You need these rivalries. Some are friendly, some are a little more vicious. And he also went on to say this about Max Verstappen. And this is the type of comment that, Zach Brown knows will get under Horner's skin, because Horner's probably going to get asked about this tomorrow, because, Brown basically said he expects Verstappen to leave Red Bull at the end of the season, because of course he believes they're going to win the championship with McLaren, and as a result Red Bull and Verstappen are not going to win the championship, and therefore the Red Bull won't be good enough to win, and Max is going to look to leave, certainly for next year when the regulations change and the 2026 engine rules seem very promising for Mercedes as it presently stands. So Brown predicted that Verstappen will leave at the end of the year, and he says if he had to guess which team he would go to, it would be Mercedes. So again, quite the comment. It's an interesting comment. It's not something that is maybe a massive surprise that Brown would say, and obviously fans have been talking about this now for quite some time, but it's still one of those comments that will get under the skin of Mr. Christian Horner. I think there's not all that much doubt about that. Okay, so someone was cutting the grass really loudly outside the window, so I thought I'll just go get a shower, put my contacts in, come back and do the other half of the video. So let's continue. Let's talk Ferrari. There was a lot of talk this weekend about what they changed in Australia to go from looking on par with the McLaren on Friday to being nowhere for the rest of the weekends. And reportedly, this has to do with ride heights. Well, I guess we'll see in China whether this remains true. But apparently the level of ride height they had to run to get the performance they did was actually causing some damage to the floor plank to such an extent that they would have been disqualified over a Grand Prix distance. And that is a serious issue. Like, if their performance that they're getting from their car is dependent on running at a certain ride height that they've actually realised they cannot run at, that is a problem that is not like an easy fix. So there's talk about Ferrari, why they were struggling. The reality is that they have 1 hour in China this weekend to set up their car, and it's got brand new bitumen as well, so they've resurfaced the track again in China this year. So it raises even more questions. Every team is kind of going to be in no man's land, but the teams that have difficulties understanding their car, as Ferrari seem to be one, will arguably suffer even greater. Interestingly enough, the SF25 in quali was 7/10 quicker than last year's car, but that's not actually a massive delta compared to what some of the other teams were delivering, given the track conditions this year were substantially better than they were for qualifying last year. It was gaining good time in most corners, but in the medium speed corners, it was actually losing 0.4 of a second to even the old car, which is, not good, like really not good at all. I mean, according to De Kessler, it was as if the car was like had like no downforce. They had damage to the floor or something that was causing them to lose a load of downforce, but actually they had no damage to the floor or any of the other parts. So it's looking like a long road back for Ferrari right now. But of course we are very early in the season, but it is not a great start looking like for them right now. De Kessler also does say that the teams will make some adjustments to their rear wings. You can actually kind of see this slight gap, right, what you might call the mini DRS. Now this gap will exist. The issue is the flexibility, whether this gap is increasing at high speed by a manner which is not deemed appropriate by the Formula 1 governing body, the FIA. Apparently teams will do, makeshift inventions, because it's not like they can just bring a new rear wing that doesn't flex in that way. They will have to use, kind of homemade solutions, as it were, band-aid solutions, in order to prevent it flexing from the new regulations they brought in with the new technical directive. According to most sources, it shouldn't make much difference, but I guess time on that one will tell. Let's talk, though, about the FIA and the 2028 potentially V10 era return. If you guys aren't aware, we currently have the turbo hybrid era, which is roughly 85% of the power comes from the internal combustion engine, which is now running a substantial percentage of that fuel is sustainable, but it's certainly not fully sustainable fuels. And you can debate on what fuel actually is sustainable and what is not, or where this stuff comes from, and like, is the electricity sustainable in the electrical side, depending on where the electricity is being sourced from. The batteries, are they sustainable from, the lithium and all this stuff that goes into creating them? There's all sorts of debates on this that will be had time immemorial. I like the sound of the V10 engine. I think most Formula 1 fans would like to return to that if possible. And also the fundamental reason why nowadays the cars are so heavy is because of the batteries which are required to make this work. The cars would be substantially lighter going back to full internal combustion. But the auto industry has believed for the last couple of decades that electric is the future. And that may still be true to some degree. And F1 is meant to be relevant for the manufacturers to innovate on things they can use in their road car. Is that as true nowadays as it used to be? Has it ever been that true? There's a debate on that, and nowadays the sport is so valuable anyway that, the teams make a load of money, the teams are worth billions of plus dollars, every single one of them, pretty much within some reason. It means that, the sport's very valuable regardless of whether they gain other benefit elsewhere as well. So, we were moving from the turbo hybrid era right now, going forward to another iteration of that really, but instead of 85-15, it's more like 50-50. The electrical component becomes much bigger. They've changed several things around. The reality is, though, with a much bigger electrical engine and motor in the car, it requires more power to deploy. And there was concerns that on the straight in Monza, they would simply run out of energy. The cars would have to, find other ways to generate the amount of, energy required to run the motor properly. And it just created a load of complications that the FIA have been working through over the last couple of years to get to a point where the teams are actually satisfied. The reality, though, is that an engine manufacturer like General Motors, they say they want to come in and make their own engine from 2028. Audi are already doing it from next year. They wouldn't have attracted these types of manufacturers, which is kind of like what the sport is trying to achieve, if it wasn't for making the regulations what they are going to be from next year. As problematic as they are, and if the fans got to choose, if the drivers got to choose, they would choose something very different to what the teams decide that fundamentally are important in this sport. But a couple of weeks ago now, there was discussion from Ben Sulayem about a potential return to V10 engines. Domenicali has talked about this, bringing, of course, from the Formula 1 side. Hamilton has made it very clear his opinions on this over the last several years, that a return to the noise and the sound, but also the benefits that come with a naturally aspirated V10 is much lighter, and you can run it theoretically on sustainable fuels. Now, what exactly that looks like, where the fuels come from, and there's a matter for debate on that, whether they're really sustainable. I know that you guys have had your thoughts in the comment section below before on that one, but this was the article that MUS come out with today, which is not behind a paywall, and they say the following: the F1 community has been discussing a contingency plan of the future for weeks. It sounds like a crazy idea, but it's increasingly taking on a serious meaning. The current regulations are to be extended by 2 years, with the goal of switching directly to cheaper V10 engines powered by climate-neutral fuel. This would be a complete reversal of Formula 1's plans to make the sport even more attractive to car companies, as we just mentioned. So, Domenicali's talked about the V10, the FIA have recently talked about the V10. It is cheaper and simpler than the current powertrains, and also than the hybrid drive system planned for 2026, which I guess is what they're calling it. It also allows for smaller and lighter cars. What initially sounded like a pipe dream has suddenly gained momentum. F1 management has other reasons to fear that next year's major rule reform could be terrible, basically. It could jeopardize the balance in the field, and thus the excitement. New cars, new engines, new tyres, the great unknown of e-fuels, a great danger that one driver will interpret the new rules better than everyone else and then pull off a show, which I think is almost inevitable, that next year the gap between the fastest team and the slowest team will be pretty mega, I would predict, at this present time. Maybe it's going to be Mercedes, maybe it's going to be somebody else. But a V10 would be a lifeline should manufacturers eventually withdraw from F1 in droves, as they did in 2009, because there might be a feeling that, okay, let's say Mercedes come out and dominate next year. Manufacturers might be like, let's say Audi might sit there thinking, well, there's no chance we can even compete with these guys. We're so far behind. We've got 5 years of these regulations. Is it really going to work out? And then there's talk about the V10s. So this is gaining some serious traction as of today. And Ben Sulayem has obviously jumped on it as well. Now, is he jumping on this because it's politically convenient? Quite possibly. But still, the rumour has it that we might get 2 years of next year's regulations. 26, 27, and then in 28 or maybe 29, then it could change substantially. And there is a fear, and very valid fear, that with all the changes and the complications and the real challenge of the regulations they are trying to employ, they're using active aero to compensate for the fact that the powertrain with the 50% hybrid is just not very good. Okay, it might be useful for the teams to learn about and develop and whatever, but they're having to use active aero in the straights and in the corners to compensate for the fact that the engine is not going to be able to deliver the power that they really need, which of course is a problem, especially if you can still be sustainable by going about it in a different way. So at this point, it seems likely that the new regulations will last for a shorter amount of time than expected. They will unlikely be scrapped entirely, although there has been some further discussion on some of the options. Thomas Maher actually did an article here on Planet F1 talking about what he had heard, and this I thought was pretty interesting as well. So he understands that manufacturers have shown a lukewarm response to the proposals, citing a lack of road relevance to the plans, which, fair, but equally, as I say, the sport nowadays is so valuable, maybe it just doesn't matter, right? There's also an argument of that. Among the biggest changes for F1 26 include a move to 50% electrification. We've talked about that at some length. But, what he went on to say is that they might use them for a couple of years, introduce them as plans, and then switch away. Understood the plans may be a negotiating tactic, with the extreme suggestion of a swift reintroduction of V10 engines potentially opening the door for a compromise solution, a return to V8 engines with a turbo and hybrid ancillaries in the future. So I think it's pretty interesting to think about all the possibilities here, and there's an article obviously that goes into quite some depth. Cadillac, for example, would be very happy about this because, yeah, they said they might come in for 2028, but they could use Ferrari for the first 2 years and then nail a V10 regulation for 2028 and beyond. That might be very ideal indeed. An insider is quoted by saying the manufacturers who are putting the most pressure to drop the new rules already know that they are behind schedule, which of course makes perfect sense. Are Mercedes going to be in favour of dropping the new rules? No chance, right? We think, because they look very good, according to sources. Teams that are behind, let's say, I mean, apparently Ferrari, now this is particularly interesting, I think especially for Hamilton as well, because if this year doesn't go to plan, next year, 2026 maybe was the year that Hamilton was going to get it done. But if Ferrari and Red Bull are in favour of a V10 return, that is almost guaranteeing that right now they feel like their 2026 engine plan is behind where Mercedes presently are. So that's what we know for now. And if you've got every team, let's say Mercedes come out and they absolutely destroy everyone in 2026, 2027, every team on the grid is going to be pushing for a return to V10s or something similar because, there will be no competition on the grid. And it's one of the reasons why this development is particularly fascinating. So I think that's pretty much where we are going to leave it for today. Very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.